Hey dreamers, welcome back to the official Sleep Whisperer. Tonight, we're not visiting the names you already know, not Washington, Lincoln, or Roosevelt. We're exploring the shadows between the pages, the men who carried the presidency quietly when the world wasn't watching. So before you settle in, take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day dissolve like mist at dawn. If you haven't already, subscribe for more whispered journeys through history and time. Now, dim the lights. Let your thoughts slow to a gentle rhythm, and drift with me through the forgotten presidencies of America. History remembers greatness in loud, brilliant flashes, monuments, speeches, victories that echo through the centuries. Washington crossing the Delaware, Lincoln delivering the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson drafting the Declaration of Independence. Their names shine, etched into memory, revered and recited. Yet between these towering figures, in the quiet spaces of time, there are others, men who held the same office, who bore the same responsibility, but whose stories slipped softly into the margins. Their footsteps were quieter, their decisions subtle, their struggles hidden beneath the weight of those who came before and after. Tonight, we begin our journey into those shadows. Imagine the room where it all began, wood-paneled, candlelit, a desk stacked with papers that might shape a nation. Portraits of great men gaze down from the walls, their eyes full of expectation, judgment, or perhaps silent encouragement. A new president sits there, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. He knows the world will not wait for him to find his voice. He knows history may barely notice him. And yet, the nation's pulse beats through his veins, and he must act, even in quietude. In the early days of the Republic, the shadow of Washington loomed large. Every decision by his successors seemed measured against his legacy. Every law passed, every foreign treaty, every whisper of policy risked comparison. To follow greatness is a peculiar kind of solitude. The public remembers triumph, but rarely the small, careful choices that keep a nation from falling into chaos. The men who came after Washington were tasked not only with governance, but with the impossible, balancing their own vision with the expectations of a nation still young, still fragile. In this quiet space, there were no grand victories to announce. The newspapers, limited and partisan, could barely report the subtleties of diplomacy, the careful management of debt, or the compromise required to hold together an often fractious Congress. Yet every choice mattered. Every quiet signature on a treaty, every unseen negotiation with foreign emissaries, every counsel given to a nervous cabinet helped shape the invisible backbone of America. These shadows were not empty. They were alive with thought, with worry, with the human struggle of men who were deeply aware of the stakes. Each night, the candles burned low, and the presidents wrote letters no one would read. Confessions of doubt and hope mingled together. Some questioned whether they were capable. Others carried guilt for decisions they knew might one day be judged harshly. And yet, through this silent labor, the nation endured. Between the monumental moments of history, the country moved forward on the careful hands of these less heralded leaders. They negotiated compromises that preserved the Union's fragile unity. They managed crises quietly, keeping rebellions, scandals, and financial turmoil from erupting into catastrophe. Their victories were subtle, a treaty avoided, a policy amended, a conflict cooled. Yet without them, history might have taken a far harsher path. And there was a human side to this quiet labor. Behind every presidential desk sat a man of flesh and bone, prone to worry, to fear, to longing. They missed home. They watched children grow from afar. They felt the pressure of every citizen's gaze, even when unseen. In their reflections, they often wondered if the office consumed them, if the weight of the Republic's expectations could ever truly be borne by a single human soul. They also wrestled with time, how fleeting it seemed, how each decision might outlast their own lives, shaping futures they would never witness. They faced the loneliness of power, the quiet despair of being misunderstood, and the subtle ache of moral responsibility that could not be shared. In this solitude, their minds became arenas of strategy, ethics, and foresight, balancing the immediate needs of a fragile nation with ideals that stretched across generations. Consider, too, the personal sacrifices these men made. Many endured heartbreak, the loss of family members, or the slow erosion of health under the pressures of office. Some carried the heavy burden of public disappointment, knowing their efforts would rarely be acknowledged, their diligence seldom celebrated. Yet their commitment to duty persisted, a quiet resilience that did not demand applause, but instead silently shaped the future. In the unrecorded hours, they wrestled with their humanity, their fears, and their hopes, all while the nation relied upon their judgment. So, tonight, as we begin this journey, picture the shadows themselves, long, still, stretching across marble halls and candlelit rooms. Listen for the quiet footsteps that echo softly behind history's most famous names. These are the men who followed greatness, not to outshine it, but to sustain it. They carried the nation through its quiet crises, guided it with subtle hands, and ensured that the story of America continued, even when no one was watching. As we drift deeper into the forgotten presidencies, remember this: greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers in the decisions no one records, in the midnight oil burned silently, in the unseen sacrifices that allow history to unfold. And in those whispers, we begin to hear the stories of America's hidden leaders, the men who shaped a nation from the shadows, quietly, carefully, profoundly. They remind us that leadership is not always in monuments or speeches. Sometimes, it resides in steadfast hearts, in patient minds, and in the silent shaping of history itself. The transition from Washington to John Adams was not just a passing of office. It was the passing of a shadow, a mantle heavier than any man might imagine. Washington's calm authority, his towering presence, had become the steady heartbeat of a young nation. And now, John Adams, fiery and intelligent, stood ready, or perhaps only willing, to take the reins. The nation looked to him with cautious eyes, some filled with hope, others with doubt. Adams, acutely aware of both, felt the weight of expectation pressing down like the humid summer air on his shoulders. In the quiet of his study, Adams often sat alone, reviewing letters from Congress, drafts of speeches, and petitions from citizens he had never met. He read each carefully, knowing that one misstep could unravel the fragile unity Washington had maintained. Yet he was no man of shadows. He had ideas, ambitions, and a sense of duty that burned within him. Still, the human side of leadership weighed heavily. He feared failure, feared the whisper of history labeling him as the man who followed greatness and faltered. Adams' presidency was immediately defined by tension between ideals and politics, between personal conviction and public expectation. He faced a young country divided by regional loyalties, by economic disputes, by the lingering shadows of revolution. He navigated these divides cautiously, aware that every decision could spark unforeseen consequences. And all the while, he wrestled with his own temperament. For Adams was a man of passionate intensity, prone to bursts of anger and moments of profound doubt. In the quiet hours of the night, he would pace the hallways of the presidential residence, pondering the course of the nation, feeling the full weight of responsibility pressing on a single human heart. Foreign affairs offered little relief. Adams faced the delicate task of preserving peace with nations whose interests often clashed with America's fragile sovereignty. France and Britain, still at odds, tested the young republic with diplomatic snares and veiled threats. Adams' solution was measured, cautious, and at times unpopular. The XYZ affair loomed like a storm on the horizon, and Adams had to balance the call for war from some factions with his desire to keep the nation intact. Every choice carried risk, every hesitation invited criticism. The tension never left him, settling instead like an invisible cloak he could never remove. Yet it was not only the nation that demanded patience. Within his own cabinet, Adams faced a subtle war of personalities. Differing opinions, clashing ambitions, and political maneuvering made every meeting a delicate dance. Adams had to act as mediator, judge, and sometimes reluctant arbiter, all while guarding his own principles. The burden was lonely. Few could understand the constant negotiation between duty and desire, between the man he was and the man history expected him to become. Even amid these challenges, Adams sought to leave a lasting mark. He championed the development of the Navy, understanding that a strong maritime presence would protect American interests and assert sovereignty on the global stage. He invested in scientific exploration and encouraged intellectual inquiry, seeing in knowledge and reason a safeguard against the chaos of factionalism. He understood that the moral and cultural growth of the nation was as essential as its political stability. Personal sacrifice accompanied public duty. Adams lived with the constant awareness that every action, every word, every misstep could ripple outward, affecting not only his own legacy, but the lives of citizens he would never meet. He endured nights of restless worry, mornings of anxious deliberation, and afternoons consumed by the relentless demands of office. The man who had once been a revolutionary thinker now felt the humbling weight of implementation, the sobering reality that ideas alone could not guide a nation. And yet, in the midst of tension, there were small victories. Adams preserved peace when war loomed, strengthened the institutions of government, and modeled leadership grounded in principle rather than popularity. He walked the fine line between ambition and restraint, human fallibility and moral responsibility. In quiet moments, he reflected not on the applause of the public, but on the enduring arc of the Republic, knowing that sometimes leadership is measured not in accolades, but in resilience. John Adams' presidency, though often overshadowed by Washington before and Jefferson after, reminds us that leadership is a human endeavor, full of tension, doubt, and subtle courage. He was a man who carried the nation forward in moments of uncertainty, whose choices shaped the country not with grandeur, but with deliberate care. In the shadows of greatness, Adams found his own voice, quiet yet firm, thoughtful yet determined. A voice that whispers still through the pages of history. Even decades later, historians and scholars reflect on Adams' moral compass, his courage to stand against public clamor, and his belief that a republic thrives not on applause, but on steadfast principle. In understanding Adams, we recognize that the weight of office is not measured by monuments, but by the quiet decisions that preserve the delicate balance of a nation, decisions often made in solitude, with no witness but conscience and time. James Madison, the smallest president in stature but colossal in intellect, often felt the weight of ideas pressing as heavily as armies on the battlefield. A scholar first, a politician second, he approached the presidency with a mind attuned to reason, philosophy, and principle. Yet the calm of intellect could not shield him from the storms that raged around the nation, the whispers of rebellion, the threats from foreign powers, and the mounting tensions within a still young republic. He understood, more deeply than most, that the health of a nation depended as much on ideas as on troops, on treaties as on trade. Madison had learned early that leadership is rarely a matter of charisma or spectacle. It is quiet, meticulous, and sometimes painfully slow. In the candlelit halls of his study, he pored over letters, state papers, and intelligence reports, calculating every consequence. Every word he wrote carried weight. Every decision had the potential to ripple across the fragile young nation. And yet, despite his careful mind, urgency pressed upon him, an invisible clock ticking with the possibility of catastrophe. The War of 1812 would define Madison's presidency, and it was not an easy path. Britain's interference with American trade, the impressment of sailors into the Royal Navy, and the ongoing shadow of frontier conflict created a pressure cooker of national tension. Many doubted that the scholar could command as effectively as a soldier. Madison, however, knew that intellect and strategy were as necessary as courage and force. He studied the Constitution, deliberated with his cabinet, and weighed every action with the care of a chess master planning many moves ahead. Even as armies marched and battles unfolded, Madison remained a thoughtful presence. He could not fight on the front lines, but he could guide the strategy, inspire unity, and make choices that might prevent disaster. When Washington, D.C. was threatened and ultimately burned in 1814, the capital itself seemed to mirror the chaos of his mind, flames licking the skyline as if the very soul of the nation were on fire. And yet, Madison acted with calm determination. He did not panic. He did not abandon hope. He found ways to rally Congress, support the military, and maintain the morale of a nation teetering on the brink. What set Madison apart was his ability to think deeply while the world around him roared. Others might have been consumed by anger or despair, but he analyzed, reflected, and acted with purpose. Even in moments of personal doubt, when letters of criticism arrived by the dozen, he turned back to his work, crafting policies, authoring speeches, and consulting with generals. His mind, sharp and disciplined, became the compass guiding the country through turbulent waters. Yet the scholar in Madison was also profoundly human. He felt the weight of lives lost in battle, the anguish of families displaced, the fear of a nation vulnerable to the ambitions of more powerful empires. Each casualty, each defeat, was a reminder that history is not only written in law and treaties, but in human suffering. Madison's leadership was an effort to reconcile these realities, the ideal of a free republic with the practical horrors of war. Beyond the battlefield and Congress, Madison nurtured the intellectual and civic foundations of the nation. He championed education, believing that a republic could survive only if its citizens were informed, thoughtful, and engaged. He corresponded with philosophers, lawmakers, and statesmen, refining ideas, debating principles, and seeking solutions to challenges that reached far beyond his immediate term. The president who might appear timid to the casual observer was, in truth, a man constantly building a framework for enduring governance. Through it all, Madison sought not personal glory but the endurance of the nation's principles. He understood that the Constitution he had helped craft was more than a document. It was a living framework meant to guide Americans through uncertainty, debate, and conflict. His decisions reflected this understanding, balancing immediate necessity with the long arc of history. Even in the fire of invasion and the chaos of retreat, he maintained the calm authority of a thinker who trusted reason above panic, strategy above impulse. In the quiet hours, when the battles ceased for a night, Madison would sit alone, reflecting on the paradox of leadership, the urgency of action against the necessity of patience, the human cost of decisions weighed against their long-term significance. He knew that the storms of history were unavoidable, but the way he steered the ship, intelligently, deliberately, ethically, would determine whether the nation endured. James Madison's presidency reminds us that leadership is not always about grandeur or spectacle. It is often about quiet vigilance, intellectual courage, and steadfast moral purpose. Even as the world burned around him, Madison thought, planned, and acted with calm urgency, leaving a legacy not of flamboyant triumph but of enduring wisdom. In the storm, he remained the scholar, proving that intellect, reflection, and thoughtful action could guide a nation safely through even its darkest hours. And perhaps most importantly, Madison's story reminds us that true leadership requires balance, the courage to act decisively when needed, yet the patience to let reason guide the path. He was small in stature, yes, but his vision, his principles, and his unwavering dedication to the Republic rendered him monumental in the annals of history. In the quiet intensity of his mind, America found a guide capable of steering a young nation through fire, uncertainty, and the fragile beginnings of its identity. His legacy whispers to us across time that intellect, morality, and careful reflection can, in their own understated way, shape the destiny of a country as powerfully as any battlefield victory. By the time James Monroe assumed the presidency, the echoes of revolution had grown quieter, and the world seemed to pause, reflecting on the young nation's journey. He was the last of the founding fathers to occupy the Oval Office, a living link to the generation that had wrestled with independence, liberty, and the dream of a new republic. With each step through the halls of power, Monroe carried the weight of history, not as a burden, but as a quiet companion, a reminder of the ideals that had shaped him and the nation he served. Monroe's presidency, often remembered for the era called the Era of Good Feelings, exuded calm. The partisan tensions that had so deeply divided previous administrations had softened, at least on the surface. There was a gentle rhythm to the country during his tenure, a sense that, for a moment, the revolutionary fire had cooled into steady embers, casting warmth rather than consuming flames. Yet beneath this calm, Monroe was vigilant. He knew that peace was delicate, that unity required both reflection and careful guidance, and that the nation's future rested on the principles he and his colleagues had fought to establish decades earlier. Imagine Monroe walking along the quiet streets of Washington, D.C., the early morning fog curling around the Capitol. He would pause to reflect on the path that had led him here, the battles fought, the treaties signed, the tireless debates in Congress, and the drafting of documents that defined the young republic. Each memory was both a comfort and a lesson. The nation had survived storms that could have torn it apart. Now it was his turn to steward this fragile peace. Foreign policy during Monroe's administration was marked by steady prudence. He navigated the complexities of European tensions with a quiet confidence, carefully asserting American sovereignty without unnecessarily provoking conflict. His most enduring act, the Monroe Doctrine, was a declaration that reflected both foresight and restraint. Rather than storming the world stage with aggression, Monroe's vision was protective, philosophical. The Americas were to remain free from new European colonization, a guiding principle that would resonate long after his time. It was a subtle yet profound form of leadership, assertive yet measured, protective yet thoughtful. Monroe's presidency was also deeply human. He valued connection, history, and memory. He frequently reflected on the lives of those who had preceded him, honoring their sacrifices and acknowledging the fragility of their achievements. His presence in the White House was less about spectacle and more about thoughtful guidance. He walked the halls not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker of ideals, mindful of the generations that had paved the way and those who would follow. The nation itself seemed to mirror Monroe's quiet confidence. Expansion into new territories continued, and the young republic grew geographically and economically. Citizens, for a fleeting moment, felt a sense of optimism, a belief that the experiment in self-governance, still raw and imperfect, could endure. Yet Monroe never allowed this optimism to slip into complacency. He knew that history had taught harsh lessons, and that vigilance, integrity, and patience were the true guardians of freedom. Even in moments of personal reflection, Monroe's temperament revealed a peaceful wisdom. He understood the impermanence of fame and the fleeting nature of power. While others sought applause, he sought stability. While others chased recognition, he pursued enduring principles. His legacy was not carved in the grandeur of battle or the pomp of ceremony, but in the subtle shaping of a nation at a critical moment, a bridge between revolutionary fervor and the future yet to come. Yet there were challenges even in this era of good feelings. Sectional disputes over the expansion of slavery into new territories tested the nation's fragile unity, and Monroe approached these debates with careful negotiation and moral consideration. He listened, weighed arguments, and sought compromise, aware that every decision could inflame passions or preserve peace. Similarly, he championed infrastructure, education, and economic policies designed to strengthen the fabric of the republic, all executed quietly, without the fanfare that often accompanies political triumph. Monroe also understood the power of example. In his personal conduct, simplicity, and dedication to public service, he offered a model of leadership rooted not in spectacle, but in moral clarity. He encouraged civility, dialogue, and reflection, believing that the character of leaders would shape the character of the nation itself. His personal warmth and dignity left an impression on colleagues, citizens, and foreign envoys alike, building respect that extended far beyond his administration. Beyond policy, Monroe was attentive to the human experience of governance. He recognized that behind every law, every treaty, and every economic decision were real people, families striving, workers laboring, and citizens yearning for stability. He walked a delicate line between idealism and pragmatism, always aware that the arc of leadership is measured not in immediate acclaim, but in the quiet endurance of societal trust. Even small gestures, his careful attention to correspondence, thoughtful listening in cabinet meetings, or personal counsel to legislators, carried profound implications for a nation still learning the contours of self-rule. As we drift through the story of Monroe, the last of the founding fathers, we see a leader defined not by battles won or headlines made, but by the quiet, steady hand that preserves ideals, nurtures peace, and honors the continuum of history. In his calm, reflective way, Monroe ensured that the promise of the American experiment endured, whispering through time to those who would follow. He teaches us that true leadership is often quiet, measured, and principled, an enduring current beneath the roar of history, guiding a nation steadily forward. John Quincy Adams entered the presidency with a mind honed by diplomacy, a conscience shaped by principle, and a spirit unbroken by compromise. He was not a man of ease, nor a seeker of fleeting popularity. He was a man devoted to the idea that leadership carried a moral responsibility far greater than ambition or applause. From the moment he took office, it was clear Adams would fight not for himself, but for the enduring ideals of the nation, even when the path was lonely and the opposition fierce. His presidency unfolded in an era of tension, where political factions had grown louder and partisan rivalry threatened the fragile fabric of democracy. Yet Adams remained resolute, guided by a moral compass forged in experience and reflection. He believed that the presidency was not a seat for convenience or vanity, but a platform for principle. In every negotiation, every debate, and every decision, he sought the higher path, one that honored both the Constitution and the conscience of the people. Adams had long been a man of the world. His years as diplomat, minister, and Secretary of State had taught him the delicate balance of power, the subtleties of negotiation, and the weight of promises made between nations. Yet he knew that governing at home was even more treacherous. Policies could divide families as easily as Congress. Words could inflame passions that reason could not calm. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that integrity, even when unpopular, must guide leadership. He championed infrastructure, education, and scientific advancement, investments in a future that some considered distant luxuries. Canals, roads, and institutions of learning were more than projects. They were symbols of a nation striving toward enlightenment and progress. Adams understood that the health of the republic depended not only on laws and treaties, but on knowledge, civic virtue, and the moral courage of its citizens. Yet opposition was relentless. Partisan forces, determined to thwart him at every turn, labeled him aloof, out of touch, even unfit. Political maneuvering, attacks in newspapers, and the maneuverings of ambitious rivals tested him daily. Adams could have yielded to expediency, tempered his ideals for the sake of approval, or sought refuge in compromise. But he refused. He chose to fight, not for acclaim, but for the principles he believed would sustain the nation for generations to come. Even outside the walls of government, Adams' fight continued. After leaving the presidency, he dedicated himself to the fight against slavery in the House of Representatives. There, he became a relentless voice for the oppressed, an unyielding moral conscience in a chamber often deaf to justice. He challenged indifference, spoke truths many feared to utter, and worked tirelessly to awaken the nation to the contradictions between liberty and bondage. His convictions illuminated a moral clarity that few possessed, demonstrating that the measure of leadership extends far beyond the limits of any single office. Adams' personal life reflected the same discipline and moral rigor that guided his public service. He rose early, devoted hours to reading and reflection, and maintained an exacting schedule that left little room for frivolity. He nurtured his intellect, keeping abreast of philosophy, science, and international affairs, understanding that a leader's wisdom depended on constant study and engagement with the world. In private, he faced doubts and moments of loneliness, aware that unwavering principle often led to isolation and criticism. Yet he embraced these challenges as part of the cost of conscience-led leadership, knowing that fleeting popularity could never substitute for integrity. Moreover, Adams understood that leadership was measured not by applause, but by the enduring impact of ideas and actions. He corresponded with thinkers, legislators, and ordinary citizens, fostering dialogue that encouraged reflection, civic responsibility, and moral awareness. His vision of America was one where education, ethics, and justice would advance in tandem, creating a society capable of sustaining liberty and equality for generations. Adams also recognized the profound responsibility of example. He carried himself with a sense of dignity that reflected the seriousness of office. His manners, his speeches, even his written correspondence conveyed a belief that leadership was inseparable from character. In an era where political theatrics often overshadowed principle, Adams' consistent moral presence stood in stark contrast, quietly reminding the nation that governance was a solemn endeavor. Furthermore, Adams' intellectual curiosity never waned. He pursued knowledge not for vanity, but for service. Maps, scientific treatises, diplomatic journals. These were tools he used to sharpen judgment, to make informed decisions, and to anticipate challenges before they became crises. In his approach, one sees a profound truth. Leadership is as much about preparation, reflection, and insight as it is about action. John Quincy Adams' story is a testament to the enduring power of moral courage in leadership. His presidency, though challenged by opposition and often underappreciated, exemplified the quiet strength of determination, the kind of strength that does not seek applause, yet shapes history profoundly. Through infrastructure, education, diplomacy, and relentless advocacy for justice, he wove the fabric of a nation more resilient, more principled, and more aware of its responsibilities to all its citizens. In the end, Adams reminds us that leadership is rarely about spectacle or acclaim. It is about vision sustained by integrity, action guided by conscience, and persistence in the face of resistance. Even when history initially overlooks such figures, their influence endures, shaping law, thought, and the moral trajectory of a nation. Adams' life whispers across time. True leadership is steadfast, principled, and patient, capable of guiding a country not merely through immediate crises, but toward its highest ideals. Martin Van Buren, often overlooked in the grand tapestry of American presidents, carried the weight of office with a quiet intellect and a mind attuned to the subtle currents of power. He was not a man of spectacle or flamboyance, but a strategist, an architect of politics whose careful calculations guided the machinery of government with precision. To understand Van Buren is to step into the complex world of early 19th century American politics, a landscape of faction, ideology, and ambition, where the art of compromise often determined the nation's survival. Van Buren's presidency emerged at a turbulent time. The country faced economic challenges, debates over states' rights, and tensions that tested the endurance of its democratic experiment. As the first president born a United States citizen, rather than a colonial subject, Van Buren carried the symbolic weight of a new generation. Yet he understood that symbolism alone could not sustain a nation. Policies, diplomacy, and careful negotiation were essential, and he approached each decision with the meticulousness of a scholar and the shrewdness of a seasoned statesman. His temperament was reflective, often measured, and at times misunderstood. Critics labeled him distant, calculating, even cold, but beneath the composed exterior lay a mind constantly analyzing, anticipating, and planning. Van Buren believed that leadership required understanding not only the law and the Constitution, but also the subtle dynamics of power, the intricate web of interests, and the motivations of those who governed alongside him. He was an architect, constructing frameworks that could endure political storms, even if the public eye rarely noticed the invisible scaffolding he built. Economic hardship marked much of his presidency. The Panic of 1837 struck early in his term, shaking the nation's confidence. Banks failed, businesses faltered, and citizens faced uncertainty. Van Buren responded with careful policy, advocating for fiscal responsibility and the establishment of systems to stabilize the economy. Though his measures were pragmatic rather than dramatic, they reflected his belief that true leadership lies in thoughtful management, not in populist gestures. The subtlety of his actions often went unrecognized, but history would later see the foresight embedded in his decisions. Foreign policy, too, required the steady hand of a planner. Van Buren navigated delicate relationships with European powers, Native American nations, and the expanding territories of the United States. Every treaty, every negotiation, demanded patience and a keen awareness of nuance. He understood that diplomacy was not merely about words on paper, but about the balance of interests, the anticipation of consequences, and the cultivation of trust, even amid tension. Yet Van Buren was not merely a technician of politics. He was human, sensitive to public opinion, aware of the personal consequences of policy, and deeply conscious of the burdens that office placed upon an individual. He understood that a president's decisions ripple far beyond the corridors of power, affecting families, communities, and generations. His reflections often carried a quiet melancholy, a recognition of the loneliness inherent in leadership, where every choice involves both responsibility and sacrifice. Van Buren's careful approach to politics extended to his personal conduct. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he avoided unnecessary flamboyance or ostentation, focusing instead on observation, analysis, and preparation. In the privacy of his study, he would pore over economic reports, congressional debates, and correspondence from governors and diplomats. He understood that knowledge was power, but more importantly, it was the foundation of decisions that could prevent disasters and maintain stability. His foresight in structuring policies reflected a long-term vision, aiming to build a republic resilient to the unpredictable tides of politics and economics. Despite these challenges, Van Buren demonstrated resilience. He sought compromise without surrendering principle, governance without grandiosity, and leadership without the need for constant acclaim. In his approach, one sees the complexity of political life, the need to weigh competing interests, the necessity of patience, and the quiet courage required to act decisively amid uncertainty. Even as criticism mounted and popular opinion swayed against him, he maintained his focus on reasoned governance, trusting that history would ultimately recognize the integrity and thoughtfulness of his service. Martin Van Buren's legacy is subtle, almost hidden, yet deeply significant. He reminds us that leadership is not always visible in monuments or celebrated in history books. Sometimes, it resides in the careful architecture of policy, in the management of crises, and in the steady hand guiding a nation through turbulent times. He is a quiet testament to the fact that the machinery of democracy requires thoughtfulness, complexity, and persistence, qualities that, though often overlooked, shape the course of history profoundly. In Van Buren, we see the embodiment of the political mind, reflective, strategic, and softly powerful. His presidency, like a hidden keystone in an arch, holds together structures that might otherwise falter. In the later years of his life, as he observed the nation he helped stabilize, Van Buren often reflected on the ephemeral nature of recognition and fame. He understood that the true measure of leadership is not applause but endurance, how a leader's choices strengthen the institutions and moral fabric of a nation. And in the quiet spaces of history, he whispers to us the truth that some leaders do not seek the spotlight. They build the foundation, and their influence endures in the strength of the nation they helped preserve. Franklin Pierce ascended to the presidency with a heart both tender and burdened, a man whose gentle nature often clashed with the turbulent times he inherited. He was not a warrior, nor a politician driven by ambition alone. He was a human being caught in the relentless currents of history. The country he led was fractured, its divisions deepening over slavery, sectional tensions, and the restless expansion of new territories. Pierce felt these fractures keenly, as if the nation's unrest mirrored the quiet turmoil within his own soul. Pierce's personal life had been marked by sorrow. Long before assuming office, tragedy struck, leaving him bereaved and haunted by grief. The loss of loved ones had instilled in him a profound sensitivity, a capacity to feel deeply the sorrows of others. Yet the presidency demanded decisiveness, political acumen, and the ability to confront challenges head-on, qualities often at odds with his delicate temperament. From the start, he faced a country ready to test his gentleness against the harsh realities of governance. The nation's divisions loomed like storm clouds. The contentious debate over the extension of slavery into new territories festered, threatening to tear the Union apart. Pierce, striving for balance, sought to maintain peace while upholding the Constitution, but the pressures of compromise often became a crucible of frustration. He attempted to navigate a political landscape filled with hardening factions, knowing that every decision, every policy, carried consequences for a nation already strained by mistrust and resentment. Pierce's gentleness was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed him to empathize with suffering and approach issues with humanity. On the other, it left him vulnerable in a political arena where strength and assertiveness often dominated. Critics accused him of indecision. Allies sometimes feared his sensitivity hindered firm leadership. Yet beneath these judgments lay a profound human truth. Pierce was a man striving to govern a nation whose wounds ran deeper than policy could heal. Foreign affairs demanded as much tact as domestic governance. Pierce sought to expand trade and strengthen America's position on the global stage, but international diplomacy was often complicated by the tensions at home. Every treaty, negotiation, and official correspondence became a delicate exercise in maintaining credibility without igniting new conflicts. He approached these matters with care, a scholar of nuance rather than a commander of force, reflecting his enduring hope that reason could prevail over aggression. Pierce's presidency was deeply intertwined with the Compromise of 1850's aftermath and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, legislation that inflamed sectional tensions and fueled violent conflict in the territories. While his predecessors had wrestled with the seeds of division, Pierce now faced their rapid growth. His enforcement of federal law, including the Fugitive Slave Act, drew criticism from many in the North, while his moderation was derided in the South. He stood, as ever, attempting to uphold the Constitution with impartiality, even as the nation's factions hardened against compromise. And yet, Pierce could not escape the tragedies of leadership. His administration became entangled in crises he neither sought nor relished, controversies that inflamed passions and tested the bonds of unity. Each decision weighed heavily. Each outcome haunted him with the knowledge that the gentle cannot always shield the vulnerable from the harsh winds of politics and history. Behind the public debates and partisan newspapers, Pierce's private reflections were filled with worry, sorrow, and the burden of knowing that some conflicts could not be soothed by empathy alone. Pierce's humanity shone most clearly in the small, quiet acts that history often overlooks. He corresponded personally with citizens affected by war, poverty, or injustice. He listened patiently to advisors and critics alike, striving to understand perspectives that differed from his own. His gentleness was not weakness. It was a reflection of a mind attuned to human suffering, a heart conscious of the cost of each choice. Even amid the storm of criticism, he remained a figure of conscientious reflection, seeking solutions that balanced principle with prudence. Yet sorrow lingered. The gentle president felt the toll of the nation's unrest and the personal burdens of office with a weight that few could bear. He walked the halls of the White House, contemplative, haunted by both loss and responsibility, a man acutely aware that history's judgment often favors boldness over empathy, decisiveness over sensitivity. Still, he persevered, guided by conscience, empathy, and a quiet belief in the potential for peace. Pierce's legacy is a meditation on the human side of leadership. He teaches that governance is not only the exercise of power, but also the endurance of heart, the recognition of tragedy, and the constant effort to reconcile personal conviction with public duty. His presidency reminds us that not all leaders are warriors. Some are custodians of conscience, tasked with navigating tumultuous waters with sensitivity, integrity, and a deep regard for humanity. Even amid turmoil and criticism, Pierce strove to temper the harshness of his era with a gentleness that endured beyond the headlines. In the corridors of history, his quiet, reflective leadership whispers lessons about empathy, patience, and moral courage. His story resonates as a reminder that the human spirit, even when burdened and challenged, can shape the course of a nation through the steady, unseen work of care, conscience, and principle. James Buchanan assumed the presidency at a moment when the United States teetered on the edge of a precipice. The nation was fraying, torn by sectional tensions, debates over slavery, and the ominous rumblings of secession. To Buchanan, the weight of office felt almost physical, a pressing gravity that seemed to slow the very air around him. History would remember him as a man of principle and legal mind, yet it was his inability to act decisively that cast a long shadow over his legacy. Buchanan was a consummate lawyer, a diplomat, a master of procedural knowledge. He understood the Constitution intimately, aware of its checks and balances, its delicate architecture designed to prevent tyranny. Yet this knowledge, which might have been a source of strength, became a cage. He hesitated where others might act, measured where immediacy was required. To the nation spiraling toward disunion, his caution felt like inaction, his deliberation like paralysis. The country was already divided when Buchanan entered the White House. Southern states, fearful of restrictions on slavery, eyed the presidency with suspicion. Northern voices demanded assertiveness, protection of liberty, and moral clarity. Buchanan sought to navigate these tensions with the poise of a scholar and the careful reasoning of a lawyer. Yet the world of ideas could not stop the currents of fear, anger, and ambition that surged through Congress, state legislatures, and city streets. For months, Buchanan watched the rise of secessionist sentiment, contemplating legal remedies, consulting advisors, and reflecting on precedent. Yet he stopped short of decisive action. His inaction, born of a rigid adherence to procedure and a desire to maintain neutrality, allowed crises to deepen. South Carolina and other states began to edge toward withdrawal from the Union, emboldened by a president who seemed unwilling or unable to confront the gathering storm. Each day of delay, each missed opportunity, magnified the sense of dread that hung over the nation like thick, unyielding fog. Buchanan's personal temperament compounded the tension. He was methodical, contemplative, and perhaps overly reliant on legal reasoning to solve fundamentally political and moral problems. In the quiet halls of the White House, he wrestled with questions of duty, law, and principle, yet he never fully reconciled these with the urgent cries of a nation in peril. His decisions, or indecisions, were marked by a heavy, somber patience, a refusal to force confrontation even as the fire of rebellion drew closer. One can imagine Buchanan walking alone through the empty corridors of the executive mansion at night, the weight of the Union pressing upon him. Outside, the country stirred, and within, the machinery of governance creaked under the strain of uncertainty. Letters piled on his desk, appeals for action, warnings of insurrection, arguments from allies and critics alike. Every document reminded him of the precariousness of his position. Every choice underscored the stakes of failure. Yet he continued to calculate, to weigh, to deliberate, even as events accelerated beyond the reach of careful reasoning. When the first states finally seceded, Buchanan's response was cautious, almost ghostly in its passivity. He declared secession illegal in theory, but did not act to prevent it in practice. The gap between principle and action widened. The quiet dread of indecision settled like dust over the nation, a heavy silence that spoke louder than cannon fire or political speeches. Historians would later criticize him for freezing before the fire. Yet in those moments, one can almost feel the human hesitation, a man trapped by his own ideals, by the machinery of law, and by the immensity of a crisis he had not engineered, yet could not escape. Buchanan's presidency also underscores the limitations of even the most disciplined intellect in times of moral catastrophe. He could reason, interpret, and foresee consequences with clarity, yet foresight alone did not summon action. Advisors urged firmness, Congress pressed for leadership, and yet he remained ensnared in legalistic contemplation. The human cost of hesitation became evident in every march towards secession, in every inflammatory speech, in every battle of rhetoric and law that failed to avert disaster. Even his personal life reflected the weight of the office. Buchanan was deeply private, introspective, and sensitive to the isolation that the presidency imposed. Friends and confidants noted his melancholy, his moments of despair, and his restless nights spent pacing the halls in reflection. He was painfully aware that history would judge him not only for what he did, but for what he failed to do. And yet, he continued, constrained by principle, by temperament, and by the fear that any action could worsen the spiral towards civil war. In the end, James Buchanan's legacy is a somber meditation on the human dimensions of leadership. It teaches that wisdom without courage, principle without resolve, can imperil a nation. His presidency is a cautionary tale of indecision in the face of moral and political crisis, a reminder that the weight of a nation demands not only intellect, but decisive action. Buchanan's name, though often maligned, whispers through history as a warning. That hesitation in critical moments can be as consequential as any bold choice, and that the quiet corridors of power often hide the heavy burden of a man who knew the right path, but could not find the will to follow it. Rutherford B. Hayes entered the presidency at a moment when the United States was still bearing the scars of civil war and Reconstruction. The nation was weary, fractured, and uncertain, seeking guidance not only from law and policy, but from the integrity of the man at its helm. Hayes, known for his honesty and moral steadfastness, stepped into this role with a quiet resolve, determined to restore trust, to heal divisions, and to guide the country toward a sense of unity and dignity. Hayes' journey to the White House had been marked by service, sacrifice, and a reputation for incorruptibility. As a veteran of the Civil War, he understood both the horrors of conflict and the profound costs of disunion. He had witnessed the courage of soldiers on the battlefield and the resilience of communities shattered by war. This firsthand knowledge shaped his presidency, instilling a sense of responsibility that transcended politics, ambition, or partisan gain. His mission was clear: rebuild the nation not with grandiose gestures, but with deliberate, thoughtful action grounded in honesty. The path was not easy. The post-Reconstruction era was fraught with tensions, from regional resentments to debates over civil rights and economic recovery. Hayes approached these challenges with careful, empathetic consideration. He knew that decisions made in haste or for political convenience could unravel fragile progress. Instead, he relied on integrity as his guiding principle, demonstrating that moral clarity could be a powerful force for governance. In cabinet meetings, in public addresses, and in quiet counsel, Hayes' commitment to honesty inspired confidence, creating a sense of stability in a time of uncertainty. One of his most significant and controversial acts, the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, was guided by a desire to promote reconciliation. Hayes understood the delicate balance between enforcing justice and encouraging unity. By acting with restraint, he sought to foster healing, allowing communities to begin rebuilding without the constant pressure of federal intervention. Though the decision drew criticism from some who feared it would weaken civil rights protections, it reflected Hayes' deep belief in the necessity of measured, thoughtful leadership, the kind that aims for long-term restoration rather than short-term approval. Hayes' commitment to reform extended beyond politics into the broader moral fabric of governance. He fought to clean up corruption, insisting that public office should serve the people and not personal gain. His quiet determination in this regard set a standard for integrity that contrasted sharply with the political maneuverings of his time. Citizens could trust that Hayes' words matched his actions, and this simple authenticity resonated deeply in a nation craving reliability and fairness. Even in moments of criticism and opposition, Hayes maintained a gentle yet firm demeanor. He listened attentively, considered the perspectives of others, and acted decisively when conscience demanded it. His leadership style was not flamboyant or theatrical. It was steady, warm, and rooted in principle. Hayes understood that rebuilding a nation requires patience, empathy, and consistency, and he carried these values into every decision, every meeting, and every public engagement. Beyond the office, Hayes' personal warmth and humility left an impression on those around him. He engaged with citizens, soldiers, and colleagues with a kindness that made leadership approachable. His home life reflected the same values: simplicity, care for family, and an unwavering moral compass. In these qualities, Hayes demonstrated that leadership is as much about character as it is about policy. Hayes' presidency also demanded careful attention to the growing economic and social transformations of the nation. Industrialization, urban growth, and westward expansion presented new challenges that required thoughtful legislation and strategic foresight. Hayes approached these issues with his signature deliberation, balancing progress with caution and ensuring that economic policies did not exacerbate social tensions. He believed that the stability of the nation relied not only on political reconciliation, but also on sustainable growth and social harmony. In addition, Hayes understood the importance of public perception in leadership. By maintaining honesty, transparency, and moral authority, he sought to rebuild the public's trust in the presidency itself, reminding citizens that the office could embody virtue as much as power. His quiet example encouraged a form of civic confidence that was essential to the nation's healing, proving that trust and respect can be as powerful as legislation in guiding a country forward. Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency is a testament to the quiet power of honesty, moral courage, and patience. In an era shadowed by conflict and mistrust, he provided a steady hand, restoring hope and demonstrating that leadership could be rooted in integrity, empathy, and foresight. His legacy reminds us that rebuilding is not always about grand displays or immediate victories. It is about trust, careful judgment, and the patient cultivation of unity and justice. In remembering Hayes, we see a leader who quietly healed, balanced principle with pragmatism, and left the nation stronger not through spectacle, but through steadfast moral guidance. His presidency whispers a comforting truth. Even in times of division and doubt, honesty and integrity can illuminate a path toward restoration and hope, proving that character often shapes history more profoundly than charisma. As we drift through the stories of America's forgotten presidents, a quiet realization emerges. Not all leaders are celebrated in grand monuments or etched into history books in bold letters. Some guide quietly, influence subtly, and shape the nation's course through patience, principle, and the unassuming exercise of moral courage. These men, the often overlooked, the shadowed figures, remind us that greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, leaving traces in the hearts of citizens and the enduring institutions of a nation. History favors the dramatic. It immortalizes the wars won, the speeches that thunder, and the revolutionary acts that ignite public imagination. Yet the true fabric of governance is often woven by those who operate in subtler rhythms, who balance principle with pragmatism, and who navigate crises with reflection rather than spectacle. John Adams, James Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Rutherford B. Hayes. Each carried responsibilities heavy enough to crush a lesser spirit, yet each left a distinct imprint, not always recognized, but profound in its quietude. Consider the human dimension of these men. They were not invincible, nor immune to sorrow, doubt, or error. Some faced immense personal tragedy, others the relentless pressures of political opposition. Some hesitated where decisiveness was required, others persevered when compromise tempted them. Yet in every story, there is a common thread: the courage to act, to reflect, to endure, even when recognition was uncertain and applause minimal. In this quiet endurance lies a legacy often overlooked, a testament to the subtle ways leadership shapes the nation. Philosophically, the lives of these forgotten presidents invite reflection on the nature of influence. True leadership is not measured solely by fame or adulation. It is measured by the resilience of institutions, the advancement of justice, and the preservation of values across generations. These men remind us that progress is not always visible in a single moment. It is accumulated through thoughtful decisions, moral integrity, and the steady guidance of conscience over decades. They teach us that even small acts, carried out with care and principle, can echo far beyond the lifespan of any administration. The stories of these presidents also reflect the fragility of memory. Public attention is fleeting. Fame often belongs to those who speak the loudest or act with the greatest drama. Yet the quiet architects of governance, those who stabilize, who deliberate, who persist through adversity without seeking the limelight, build the scaffolding upon which the nation stands. Their work is subtle, often invisible, yet without it, the edifice of democracy would falter. In honoring their contributions, we cultivate a deeper understanding of leadership itself, complex, patient, and profoundly human. There is also a philosophical comfort in contemplating these figures. They teach that leadership is not solely a matter of glory or renown, but of responsibility, empathy, and ethical steadfastness. They show us that even in moments of failure, hesitation, or criticism, a commitment to principle and to the greater good endures. The forgotten presidents whisper that history is not only the story of victories or battles, but also of careful stewardship, thoughtful reflection, and the courage to act in accordance with conscience, even when the world does not notice. Moreover, their lives remind us of the weight of moral courage in leadership. While some sought applause, they sought wisdom. While others pursued fleeting influence, these men labored in patience, guided by intellect, empathy, and an unwavering sense of duty. They confronted crises, political, social, and personal, not with flamboyance, but with a quiet determination to preserve the nation's principles. Their triumphs were not always heralded in the press or celebrated in public ceremony, yet they formed the bedrock of continuity, resilience, and governance. As we draw this journey to a close, imagine sitting in a quiet room, the day slipping gently away, reflecting on the lives of these men. Their whispers reach across time, reminding us that leadership, at its core, is human. It is the balance of intellect and empathy, of courage and patience. It is the willingness to bear burdens unseen, to make choices that may never be lauded, and to shape the course of a nation in ways both subtle and profound. In the end, the quiet legacy of America's forgotten presidents is not lost. It resides in the enduring principles of the Republic, in the institutions that continue to function, and in the moral lessons they impart. They remind us that history is layered, that impact is not always immediate, and that greatness often resides in perseverance, reflection, and integrity. Even without applause, their contributions ripple forward, shaping the present and the future in ways both gentle and enduring. As we drift to sleep, we carry with us the echoes of their quiet courage. We remember that greatness is not always shouted. Sometimes it is written in the margins, softly, patiently, like a whisper, guiding, teaching, and enduring beyond the passage of time. They are a testament to the truth that leadership is often quiet, patient, and moral, and in that quiet, the soul of a nation is preserved. As you drift to sleep, remember, greatness isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's written in the margins, softly, like a whisper.